Petit, ces Ivoiriens là, ils te regardent. Tatini Kolaïo, Tatini Kolaïo, Tatini Kolaïo, Tatini Kolaïo, Mossi Youa, Tatini Kolaïo, Tatini Kolaïo, Mokossi, Tatini Kolaïo, Tatini Kolaïo, Mokossi, Tatini Kolaïo. Est-ce qu'on peut s'applaudir s'il vous plaît? C'est comme ça je suis. C'est pourquoi on ne me provoque pas. Je dis un seul nom. Je vais dire un seul nom. N'ayez pas peur. Ils sont un mois. Koutou Babola, c'est les Yakazé. Koutou Babola, je vais entendre, c'est les Yakazé. Attends, Koutou Babola, c'est les Yakazé.
La 12e TV, la diaspora s'exprime. La 12e TV, la diaspora s'exprime.
Voilà, donc mesdames, mesdemoiselles, messieurs, comme je disais, d'abord nous vous souhaitons la bienvenue sur notre chaîne de NTV dans l'émission Tamérie. Nous revoilà après un long moment d'absence dû à l'épidémie du Covid. Nous revoilà sur des MTV dans notre émission Tamérie où nous allons à rebrousse-poil contre toute l'actualité et surtout la géopolitique et la géostratégie. Alors, nous avons ici ce soir, nous allons parler du cas de l'Éthiopie et ce qui s'y passe depuis plusieurs années. Pour nos auditeurs ouest-africains, nous souhaitons expliquer la crise récente en Éthiopie et en Érythrée et comment elle représente plusieurs similitudes avec une autre crise dans l'ouest de l'Afrique, celle de la Côte d'Ivoire. Cette émission portera sur la guerre hybride que le TPFL, excusez-moi, le Front de libération du peuple du Tigré, parti cléopâtrique au pouvoir en Éthiopie depuis 1991 à 2018, et ses alliés, ceux qui ont exercé au cours de ces 3 dernières décennies dans la région de l'Éthiopie, de l'Érythrée et au-delà, ainsi que leur implication récente dans la guerre qui a commencé en novembre 2020. Nous ferons de brèves comparaisons entre la guerre d'Éthiopie, entre le TPLF et le gouvernement éthiopien d'Abiy Ahmed, avec la crise qui a frappé la Côte d'Ivoire de 2002 à 2022. Nous aborderons les différents aspects de notre guerre, de cette guerre hybride, les rebelles par procuration, la diplomatie trompeuse, les soutiens militaires, les médias et les ONG utilisés comme outils de désinformation, les opérations psychologiques, ainsi que l'instrumentalisation des agences internationales dont l'ONU. Nous parlerons également des menaces en cours et nous parlerons aussi du massacre qui se passe en ce moment dans les régions Amara et Afar, que nous pourrions que ces massacres dans ces 2 régions, Amara et Afar, pourraient être qualifiés de massacres de masse. Alors, ce soir, nous avons 2 invités, et pas les moindres. Nous avons la politologue et activiste Aster Carpenelli, basée à Rome, et le chercheur journaliste et rédacteur en chef de Horn of Africa TV, Elias Amare, basé aux États-Unis, en Californie précisément. Voilà. Alors, Nikki, la parole est à toi pour l'introduction en anglais.
Bonsoir nos invités. Donc on va faire de français à anglais, mais ça va être une traduction simultanée. Donc plus tard, dans une deuxième temps, on veut aussi faire une traduction voice-over qui va être plus précis. Je pose la question en anglais à mes deux invités et Pierrette va traduire.
Ima.
A blueprint for destabilizing countries in Africa, often applied by Western powers, is the use of an armed rebellion, a proxy group whose sole purpose is to bring about regime change in the country that's targeted. In the case of Ivory Coast, this group was called the Force Nouvelle, headed by Guillaume Soro, a group which actually sprung from nowhere, had no following in the country, was trained and backed by France and Burkina Faso, and pretended even to be three different fractions, covering different parts of the country. The so-called Force Nouvelle instrumentalized ethnic grievances to justify a coup d'etat. On the 19th of September 2002, the country was split in two, leaving the north occupied for 8 years under a rebellion. This is a terrible event in the memory of Ivorians, where even the interior minister, Émile Bougou-Dodou, has lost his life. This can be compared to the TPLF attack on the 3rd of November 2020 in Tigray, Ethiopia. Donc, Elias Amare, you have described the TPLF rule as one of ethno-apartheid. Can you expand and also explain what has the relationship with the TPLF and Eritrea been till 2018? I just get a translation from Pierrette of the question.
Yes. Donc, Elias Amare, vous avez qualifié le régime du TPLF d'ethno-apartheid. Pouvez-vous développer et également expliquer quelle a été la relation entre le TPLF et l'Érythrée jusqu'en 2018?
Well, thank you both for inviting me to the panel show, and I thank the previous speaker, my colleague, my sister from Ethiopia. Regarding the TPLF's relationship with Eritrea, as your previous guest, Aster, mentioned, the TPLF began its as a movement in 1975, some 47 years ago. So initially, when it was beginning, the more mature and older liberation struggle in Eritrea was led by the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. So naturally, they were resistance. They were trained and armed by the Eritrean rebels liberation movement, the EPLF. But this relationship was, from its very beginning, a very troubled relationship. Your previous guest from Ethiopia, my sister Aster, mentioned that the TPLF in 1976 had its manifesto of Greater Tigray. In this manifesto, they envisioned, the leaders of the nascent or the new organization TPLF envisioned a Greater Tigray project for the establishment of an independent Republic of Tigray. And of course, they took large territories from the Amhara, the Wolkait, Raya area, from Eritrea also. Within Tigray itself, there were several ethnicities. But they said that everybody who speaks Tigrinya is Tigray. So by this reasoning, there were some Afar, some Saho, some Kunama who live in Tigray, and probably also some Ago ethnicities. These minority ethnic groups would, according to the manifesto, were forced to become Tigrayans or Tigrinya speakers. So it had this secessionist agenda, and when it faced massive criticism from the EPLF, that there was no reason for secession or separatism in Ethiopia. Also from the other progressive Ethiopian movements such as the EPRP, and the All Ethiopian Socialist Party, the Meison. Then they dropped this secessionist agenda and just claimed broadly for right of self-determination. But all along, this TPLF manifesto, the secessionist agenda, was there up to 1991. And once they seized power in 1991, with the help of the EPLF, mind you, because militarily it was the EPLF who was stronger and had more sophisticated armaments, mechanized brigades and tanks. Without the help of the EPLF, they could not have captured state power in Ethiopia. Anyways, once they captured state power in Ethiopia in 1991, they then, as your previous guest Aster mentioned, drafted a constitution of an ethnic federalism. Nowhere in Africa is this type of constitution ever witnessed. And in this constitution, they put in an article, Article 39, that allowed for secession and separatism. This is a recipe for disaster anywhere in Africa. Why did they do that? Well, as the previous guest alluded, the Tigrayans are a minority in Ethiopia. And all along, its elite, or the ethno-fascist group that formed the TPLF, had this mentality of inferiority complex, that they were looked down by the Amharas, they were oppressed by the Amharas, that the Eritreans looked down on them. And so there was this vendetta type of psychology when they seized power. So in order to rule Ethiopia as a minority, they had to divide it along ethnic lines. So that's why I call this system an ethno-apartheid system. Why ethno-apartheid? Because just as in South Africa during the apartheid regime, you had the white minority regime ruling over the black majority, and in order to rule them, it had to divide them by tribes into ethnic Bantustans. So in a similar way, the TPLF also divided Ethiopia into ethnic Bantustans, what they called ethnic clans or regional states. So they pit one group against the other, the Oromos against the Amharas, and every ethnic group against other ethnic groups. Also, they divided society along religious lines, sectarian lines. In this way, this tiny minority group, which only constituted 5% of the entire 110 million population of Ethiopia. And mind you, Ethiopia is also a huge multi-ethnic state, like over 80 ethnic groups inside Ethiopia. So this big country, which is unwieldy, if you rule it along ethnic lines, sooner or later you will have conflicts and tensions. And that is how for 27 years, from 1991 up to 2018, when it was overthrown, that this tiny group, ethno-fascist kleptocratic group, managed to rule Ethiopia through this system of ethno-apartheid. Unless it did that, it's a tiny minority, it could not have ruled it. But of course, the other great factor that made them to rule Ethiopia, to impose power on the rest of the majority of Ethiopians, was the huge, massive support of the United States and the European Union countries such as France, Germany, UK. Without this huge support, this tiny minority group could never have ruled Ethiopia. Never, never. And finally, when the Ethiopian people rose up in defiance, they were fed up of this minority rule, of this kleptocratic group called TPLF that looted the wealth of Ethiopia to the tune of over $50 billion. Some estimate it may even be as high as $70 billion. The Ethiopian people had finally, they had it. So by the beginning of 2015, that is 7 years ago, you begin to witness in Ethiopia massive popular uprising of the youth in the Oromia region, in Amhara, and it spread like wildfire all over the country. And within 3 years, by 2018, the TPLF was forced to give power and flee to its home base in Tigray. And a reform government led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali then comes to power. Once Abiy Ahmed Ali comes to power, Another factor also that I should make mention, the TPLF also only strives through conflicts and wars. It can only survive in a situation of war. So the other way it also ruled Ethiopia was by deflecting the anger of the people by igniting war against Eritrea. There was no reason in 1998 for a border conflict, a war to be ignited against Eritrea. But why did the TPLF did that? Because that's the only way it could deflect attention away from the people of Ethiopia, from their misery and their their oppression by a tiny minority group. So by 2018, when the reform government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali comes to power, he automatically sees that peace with Eritrea is essential, and it is because he made peace with Eritrea that he then won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this ushers into the Horn of Africa, a new era of the new Horn of Africa of peace and stability. TPLF then, from its home base of Tigray, decides to scuttle this peace to return back to power. And so by 2020, November, that is 14 months ago, it ignites a war against Eritrea and a war against Ethiopia. So these are the factors by which the TPLF, this tiny minority group, was able to rule Ethiopia for over 27 years through perpetual conflict, perpetual wars, igniting ethnic conflicts, interreligious conflicts, and so on and so forth. Even to this day, it is continuing to do that, and it is being supported by its Western patrons, such as the United States and the European Union countries. I hope briefly I have answered your question.
No, thank you. That was very, very clear. Donc, je vais juste vitement traduire. La chose importante qu'il faut comprendre, c'est que dans la Constitution qu'ils ont fait, que le TPLF a fait en 91, excusez-moi, 91 ou 94, 94, c'était une constitution qui était basée vraiment sur les ethnies. C'est quelque chose de jamais vu en toute l'Afrique. Dans chaque région, était vraiment séparé par les ethnies. On a donné le nom de la région par rapport au nom des ethnies. Ce que Elias Amar nous explique, c'est que justement, comme c'était une toute petite minorité, on parle de 5% de la population sur 110 millions quand même d'habitants dans le pays. La seule manière pour eux de pouvoir rester au pouvoir, c'était de mettre un groupe ethnique contre l'autre, de créer vraiment des... Bon, d'abord, il faut dire qu'aussi dans la Constitution, il y avait un article, l'article 39, qui disait carrément qu'on peut faire une sécession, donc on peut devenir indépendante. Donc c'est pratiquement, disons, une manière de créer une constitution qui voudrait unifier un pays, mais permettre aux États de chacun de vouloir s'en aller, de partir s'ils veulent. Donc c'est un peu déjà le début pose des questions, des problèmes, non? Parce qu'on parle pas d'un État national basé sur des citoyens, mais des ethnies qui peuvent décider de quitter. Donc c'était un peu bizarre, mais la raison pour laquelle ils ont fait tout ça et pour laquelle ils ont aussi déclenché une guerre contre l'Érythrée, qui d'ailleurs, il faut se rappeler que le mouvement de libération de l'Érythrée a beaucoup aidé dans la guerre contre ce qui était Mengistu, qui était un peu un régime pro-soviétique, mais disons une vraie dictature à l'époque. Et c'était vraiment le mouvement de libération de l'Érythrée qui avait aidé aussi ce mouvement du TPLF à l'époque de libérer toute l'Éthiopie. Mais eux, ils se sont même allés contre les Érythréens en faisant vraiment une guerre en 98 pour 2 ans contre eux. Donc on comprend que c'est un petit groupe qui se sentait aussi peut-être pas à la hauteur des autres, on comprend pas vraiment. Mais la chose qu'il souligne et qui est très très important à dire, c'est que sans l'aide quand même de l'Occident, donc sans l'aide des États-Unis, de la France et aussi de l'Union européenne en général, ce groupe n'aurait pas pu rester au pouvoir pendant 27 ans. Parce que c'est quand même un groupe qui est resté au pouvoir pour 27 ans jusqu'à jusqu'à 2018. Ce qui s'est passé qu'en 2015, il y a eu vraiment des grands soulèvements dans les pays qui ont duré 3 ans. Les gens en avaient vraiment marre parce que c'était un régime quand même très répressif. Et donc, ils ont réussi quand même à faire en sorte que eux, ils se retirent dans la région du Tigré avec l'arrivée de Abiy Ahmed en 2018. Mais malheureusement, ce mouvement a encore de nouveau déclenché la guerre. On va en parler un peu plus en détail pendant qu'on avance avec l'émission.
Yes, one more point that all African countries, with the only exception of Somalia, are multi-ethnic states. Cote d'Ivoire, for example, is, I don't know, 60 ethnic groups. Am I correct? Or somewhere in that line. So nowhere in Africa is a system of ethnic politics officially instituted as was by the TPLF in Ethiopia. Why? Because all the founding fathers of Africa after colonization saw it in the wisdom that this would be a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
You institute toxic ethnicity in politics, it will lead to civil war. And so it is only in Ethiopia that we saw this type of toxic ethnic politics. Otherwise, the other exception being South Africa, of course. But South Africa is a unique apartheid system. It was designed as a racist apartheid system to keep the majority black people. They have to divide them along tribal lines, the white minority regime. Sooner or later, of course, that white minority regime was overthrown. And Ethiopia is, of course, an exception that it was the only country in Africa that was not colonized by Western colonialism. All other countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Mali, Eritrea, Somalia, was either colonized by the British, by French, by Italians, by Belgians, and so on and so forth. The only exception being Ethiopia as the one that was not colonized. But this minority group called TPLF instituted on Ethiopia a recipe for disaster called the ethnic federalism system.
C'est très important le point qu'il fait, qu'il nous a et que je vais traduire. C'est justement que un peu comme qu'il y a aucun pays en Afrique qui a créé des régions sur la base des ethnies. Le seul qui l'a fait, c'était l'Afrique du Sud pendant l'apartheid, parce que c'était une minorité blanche. Comment est-ce qu'ils pouvaient prendre le pouvoir ou tenir le pouvoir sur une grande région? Ils ont créé les Bantoustans, non? C'était les Bantoustans, et ils ont vraiment renfermé les ethnies l'un dans l'autre pour une capacité de contrôler le pays. Et c'est un peu ça ce que eux ils ont fait. Mais comme ils l'ont mis même dans leur constitution, c'est comme s'ils avaient déjà créé une recette pour le désastre. Non, c'est comme si la constitution même avait déjà mis cette question qui allait porter un désastre de sécession quand même. Et si on réfléchit bien, aucun pays, ce que dit Elias justement, c'est que les pays après l'indépendance, dans l'époque de l'indépendance, n'ont jamais pensé à faire une division ethnique de ce genre parce qu'ils savaient quand même que ça allait porter des tensions inutiles, que peut-être quelqu'un d'autre aurait pu manipuler, justement comment ça s'est passé aussi dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, comme on a vu. So the 2nd of November 2020 attack, which was described by some as Ethiopia's equivalent of the USA 9/11. And I wanted to ask Aster if you can describe this attack on the part of the TPLF of the Northern Command. But before I just ask Pierrette to translate the question.
L'attaque du 2 novembre 2020 a été décrite par certains comme l'équivalent éthiopien du 11 septembre américain. Pouvez-vous décrire cette attaque de la part du TPLF du commandement Nord?
It was actually on the 4th of November 2020 against the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, or known also as the Northern Command. Has different types, has different aspects that should be mentioned. One of this was the aim of the TPLF when it attacked the federal troops in Tigray. Just to remember, the federal group or the Ethiopian National Defense Force has been in Tigray for almost 20 years. And when the TPLF launched a massive attack on the National Defense Force, their aim was to seize the strategic weapons which were under the control of the Ethiopian Defense Force. One of the factors is this. The second is it is an attempted coup d'etat. When they attacked the National Defense Force, they were quite convinced that by destroying the National Defense Force, they would be able to seize power in Ethiopia. So it was actually an attempted coup d'etat. The other factor regarding the attack against the Ethiopian troops in Tigray was it was also an ethnic cleansing. In fact, if we see we don't have the actual number of soldiers that were killed during that day by the TPLF. Some unofficial sources report that soldiers that were killed were around 5,000 or 6,000 people. When they attacked the National Defense Force, they also perpetrated an ethnic cleansing. They killed all soldiers who were non-Tigrayans. The soldiers who came, who were considered to be Oromos, Amhara, Walaita, Kambata, were either killed or damaged, but whereas the Tigrayan soldiers were not killed. In fact, the higher officials of the Ethiopian Defense Force within the Northern Command collaborated with the special forces of TPLF in this attack that was perpetrated against the Ethiopian forces. Hence, it has different characteristics. Another thing to be mentioned about this attack is the sexual violence perpetrated against the women soldiers who were part of the Ethiopian Defense Forces. We have reports that the TPLF actually amputated the breasts of the women soldiers when they attacked the defense force. Hence, it has different characteristics. It was an attempted coup d'etat because they were planning to, and they seized the weapons, strategic weapons under the Ethiopian armed forces. It was also an ethnic cleansing. At the same time, they exercised sexual violence against the women soldiers. Generally, what was the aim of the TPLF in attacking the armed forces of Ethiopia in Tigray? The main objective of TPLF was to seize power in Ethiopia. This was the main objective of that attack.
La chose importante de comprendre, c'est que cette attaque du TPLF à l'époque, donc en novembre 2020, c'était pratiquement de attaquer l'un des centres principaux de l'armée nationale. C'était l'un des endroits où une grande partie de l'armée nationale était depuis 20 ans. Et donc, il y a trois aspects de cette attaque que Aster nous explique. C'est d'abord, leur but, c'était vraiment d'abord donc de prendre les armes parce que c'était une région où il y avait beaucoup des armes de l'armée nationale éthiopienne. La deuxième chose, c'était que c'était vraiment une tentative de coup d'État parce qu'ils voulaient vraiment prendre le pouvoir avec ça en pensant peut-être de réussir parce qu'ils se sont quand même élargis beaucoup. Et ils ont aussi ciblé vraiment les non-tigréens. C'est ça qui est assez terrible, c'est qu'on n'a pas les chiffres exacts, mais on a quand même des chiffres qui nous parlent de 6 000 morts des autres soldats parce que vraiment dans la nuit, ils ont tué les soldats qui étaient des autres ethnies. Donc si c'était des soldats Amara ou Oromo ou d'autres ethnies, ils les ont vraiment ciblés. Donc, c'était vraiment une attaque ethnique dans le sens en ciblant des ethnies qui n'étaient pas de leur ethnie. Donc, ça, c'est vraiment la troisième chose très importante à souligner de cette attaque de novembre 2020. Et l'autre chose, qu'il y avait quand même une collaboration de la part des autres officiers avec certains des TPLF, et la chose peut-être la plus désastreuse, c'était vraiment les violences sexuelles vis-à-vis des femmes. Vis-à-vis des femmes soldats, auxquelles on a aussi des rapports qu'on leur coupait les seins, que vraiment il y avait c'est vraiment une violence extrême vis-à-vis des soldats femmes. And now I ask Elias, like Eritrea, which is not known, was also attacked by the TPLF in November 2020. Or if you want to also add something about the attack in Ethiopia, because it was a very striking moment.
Yes, well, to provide a context, the November 4, 2020 attack did not happen in a vacuum. It had a context. As we mentioned before, both of us, the TPLF lost power in Ethiopia in March, the end of March or beginning of April 2018. And within its coalition, EPRDF party, election was made for the party leadership. And so Dr. Abiy Ahmed Ali was elected as the party leader, and he becomes automatically the prime minister. So the TPLF then panicked and fled to its home base in the north, Tigray. And from there, they didn't rest. They started to conspire as a means to return to power. And so they spread from there. Mind you, they had control of the army and the security intelligence apparatus of Ethiopia for 27 years. So they had network operatives, mercenaries all over Ethiopia. And they started to instigate conflicts all over Ethiopia to make Ethiopia ungovernable for the government of Abiy Ahmed Ali. So for 2 years, from 2018 up to 2020, they were doing all these kinds of destabilization, conflict and chaos strategy, as I call it. I had written extensively in 2018. In fact, I sort of foresaw that the TPLF would not rest, would not accept defeat and leave with the situation, but they will try a strategy of chaos and conflict to destabilize Ethiopia. If they cannot rule, then nobody else can rule it. That's what they have always been saying this on record, even while they were ruling Ethiopia. My sister Aster will corroborate this for me. It's rulers such as Sebhat Aga, the eminence Greece, the grand old man, was saying, if we don't rule Ethiopia through this EPRDF, it will disintegrate. It's either us or our system of ethnic federalism or disintegration. So once they lost power, they actively worked for this type of chaos, strategy of chaos in Ethiopia. They also looked negatively at the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because as I pointed out earlier, TPLF can thrive only through conflicts and wars. So they looked with disfavor at the peace with Eritrea, and they had to disrupt that. They didn't accept it. The peace with Somalia also that was made. So this tripartite peace, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, was not in their favor, and they tried to disrupt it as much as possible. Mind you, while they were in power also, they had accumulated huge arsenal, strategic weaponry, and hid them in underground bunkers in Tigray, because they control Ethiopia, they control the military. In the Ethiopian military, the federal army, 90% of the generals were of Tigrayan ethnicity. All the officer ranks, generals, colonels, majors, it was dominated by Tigrayans. This tiny minority group, minority ethnic group of 5% controlled essentially the military, the security intelligence apparatus, the economy, everything in Ethiopia was controlled by them. So they had amassed in Tigray huge arsenal, rocket missiles, strategic weaponry. So by November 2020, they decided that they would do a coup d'etat, as my sister Aster pointed out. And in the dead of the night, while the Federal Army soldiers were asleep, they attacked them. The Northern Command, which was based in Tigray, of the Federal Army, numbered, its troop strength was 32,000. Out of these 32,000, 10,000 were of Tigrayan ethnicity, members of the TPLF. So the 10,000 automatically switched sides. Their loyalty was only to the TPLF, not to the big nation of Ethiopia. And the rest, in the dead of the night, they attacked them, they slaughtered them, they raped the women, soldiers. Only 5,000 to 6,000 fled northwards and crossed the border to Eritrea to seek refuge and asylum. Of course, Eritrea accepted them. And by this time, the TPLF also started to fire rocket missiles into Eritrea. It had what became later from intelligence findings and from captive TPLF soldiers. In Eritrea, it had 100 targets for bombardment by this long-range rocket missile. So they fired these rocket missiles, and it's on record. In fact, the American Secretary of State at that time, Mike Pompeo, came out and condemned this widening of the conflict to make it regional. That was their intention. So the intention of the TPLF in this November 4, 2020 attack was, one, to destroy the Federal Army and march southwards and capture state power by reaching Addis Ababa, and at the same time also to attack Eritrea and to invade Eritrea and effect regime change in Eritrea. This was their plan, and so Eritrea was forced. It's been attacked, and its ally, the federal government, also is being attacked. So it had to defend itself and its sovereignty. So it cleared the TPLF. It had to capture the strategic weaponry that was in the hands. It was dangerous for Eritrea's survival and also for Ethiopia's survival. So this terrorist group had to be contained. I give this analogy for American audience because I am living here in America. Imagine in America, for example, one state of, let's say, Iowa, decides to attack the Federal Army, which is based in that state, in the dead of the night. The state militia of Iowa attacks the Federal Army. Would the federal government in Washington, D.C. sit idly by? Of course not. No. This is mutiny and insurrection, and any government has to take appropriate measures to bring back law and order and ensure stability and sovereignty. So this is, in a nutshell, what happened in November 4 of 2020. It was betrayal, treasonous act, and many countries in Africa understood this. African Union also understood this, but we'll go into that question, I suppose, later in depth.
Thank you so much, Jadier. So, donc, il faut naturellement mettre l'attaque du 4 novembre 2020 dans un contexte. Depuis que le TPLF avait perdu le pouvoir avec l'arrivée de Abiy Ahmed en 2018, qui était élu comme premier ministre, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'eux, ils ont un peu paniqué, non? Ils se sont sentis qu'ils étaient en train de perdre le pouvoir. Alors, comme Élise justement souligne, la seule manière pour eux de rester au pouvoir, c'est de créer du chaos. Ça me rappelle un peu aussi Ouattara, qui dit aussi soit c'est moi, soit c'est personne qui règne. Non, il disait ça. I'm just doing a small comparison with Ivory Coast. Ouattara is very much like that too. If I don't hear nobody else, he said that even. Par exemple, ils n'ont aussi pas accepté le fait que le gouvernement d'Abiy Ahmed était aussi en train de faire une paix aussi dans la région, pas seulement avec l'Érythrée, mais aussi avec la Somalie. Donc, ça dérangeait qu'il y avait une autre, disons, une autre constitution, même des trois pays qui allaient se rapprocher sans que eux, ils avaient un rôle. Non, pour eux, c'était soit nous, soit la désintegration du pays. C'était vraiment un peu comme ça. Donc, ils n'étaient pas d'accord, même avec le fait d'arriver à cette paix dans la région. Parce que il faut pas oublier qu'une minorité de ce genre, s'il y a la paix, c'est pas eux qui vont être au pouvoir. Et c'était ça leur but, c'était de toujours créer des problèmes. Et ce qui s'est passé cette nuit-là, donc il faut d'abord rappeler aussi qu'il y a qu'ils ont tenu des élections sans que ils auraient pu ou dû les tenir. Mais après, la chose terrible, c'est que cette nuit-là, cette fameuse nuit-là du novembre 2020, le fameux coup d'État, il y avait quand même 32 000 soldats, dont 10 000 étaient plus ou moins de TPLF. Et c'est vraiment dans la nuit qu'ils ont attaqué tous leurs frères et sœurs africains. Ils les ont massacrés vraiment. Elias nous explique qu'il y a plus ou moins 6 000 qui sont allés vers l'Érythrée, donc qui sont allés se réfugier vers l'Érythrée. Mais ils ont vraiment, c'était vraiment un vrai massacre. Et ce qui se passe depuis, c'est qu'ils ont pas seulement fait ça, mais ils ont aussi attaqué avec des roquettes l'Érythrée même. Et à l'époque, sous l'administration Trump, il y avait même Mike Pompeo qui avait dit oh mais allez, ne faites pas ça, vous allez amener quand même déstabiliser toute la région. Donc il y avait cette critique au contraire.
Yeah, this is on record. He even tweeted about this. I have a screenshot capture of this for
il y a même un tweet de Pompeo qui avait dit, c'est bizarre parce que l'administration Biden fait le contraire, mais bon. Et donc, because Biden seems to be the contrary, you know, as we see. Et donc, c'était vraiment, il voulait vraiment faire réaliser un vrai coup d'État. Et Elias Amar nous explique un peu comme il était aux États-Unis. Il donne l'exemple de l'Ohio, État de l'Iowa qui décide à un certain moment d'attaquer l'armée fédérale.
Oui.
Ou bien une région de la France qui décide d'attaquer l'armée fédérale. Et donc, c'est clair que chaque pays prendrait tout de suite des dispositions nécessaires pour bloquer ça. Voilà.
Tout à fait.
Et là, on vient vers, donc on peut expliquer ce qui s'est passé, qui est ce groupe, et là, on va vers la question de la Western diplomacy. So, I ask you, in Ivory Coast, the international community pushed via French-backed peace negotiation known as Marcoussis, that the legitimate Gbagbo government negotiate and include in his government a rebel group not voted by anyone. These rebels were even split into 3 fictitious groups which existed only on paper so as to give them more weight during the negotiation process. This same request, pushing the Abiy Ahmed government to negotiate with the TPLF, has been heavily pushed by Western states, going as far as setting up a fake rebel alliance of people no one had ever heard of in Ethiopia in a meeting in Washington. And despite the fact that the TPLF had been declared a terrorist group by the Ethiopian parliament in May 2021. And my question is therefore, how has Western diplomacy dealt with this crisis since November 2020? But maybe, Pierrette, you can...
in French, yes. En Côte d'Ivoire, la communauté internationale, CEDEAO, Union africaine, Union européenne, ONU, a poussé via une négociation de paix soutenue par la France, comme connu sous le nom de processus de paix de Marcoussis, que le gouvernement légitime Gbagbo négocie et inclut. Ces organisations internationales ont obligé le gouvernement de Gbagbo à inclure dans son gouvernement un groupe rebelle qui n'a pas été élu par personne. Ces rebelles ont même été scindés en 3 groupes fictifs qui n'existent que sur le papier afin de leur donner plus de poids dans le processus de négociation. Cette même demande poussant le gouvernement Abiy Ahmed à négocier avec le TPLF a été fortement poussée par les États occidentaux, allant jusqu'à la mise en place d'une fausse alliance rebelle de personnes dont personne n'a jamais entendu parler en Éthiopie lors d'une réunion à Washington, et malgré le fait que le TPLF a été déclaré groupe terroriste par le Parlement éthiopien en mai 2021. Donc, la question s'adresse à Aster et à Elias. Pardon. Comment la diplomatie occidentale a-t-elle géré la crise depuis novembre 2020?
Well, when we talk of diplomacy regarding the TPLF and the conflict in Ethiopia, I think we have to go back to the beginning of the 1990s. We remember that till 1991, Ethiopia was governed by a military, we can call it a military dictatorship. At the head of this government was Colonel Mengistu Hailemariam. At that time, Mengistu Hailemariam had a very good relationship with various socialist countries, especially with the Soviet Union. In fact, at that time, we remember that there was what is called the Eastern Bloc. And Mengistu Hailemariam's government used to declare itself as a socialist or a communist-oriented government. Hence, when in 1991, when the TPLF came to power, the Western diplomacies were actually favorable towards TPLF, because in the West, the government of, or the regime, I would say, of Mengistu Hailemariam was considered a leftist government, a socialist and a communist government. Hence, the downfall of Mengistu Hailemariam and the coming to power of TPLF was accepted favorably by the Western democracy. And moreover, we have to take into consideration another issue regarding the diplomacy and the conflict, especially when we speak about the TPLF. And that is TPLF almost most of the time, it used to promote what's called a shifting ideology. And because it promoted this shifting ideology, that is, on one side, it presented itself as a political entity or as a political group which is anti-imperialist. On the other side, in its relation with foreign diplomats, it described itself as if it is favorable for a liberal system. And this shifting ideology has helped a lot the TPLF when it was governing Ethiopia. In fact, the support to TPLF came from groups, from left groups as well as right groups. And we see a lot of things have been done by the TPLF during the 27 years when it governed Ethiopia. It has done a large networking. It has created a close relationship with political leaders and also in the Western academic world. Because of this, it was able to gain support from the right wing and from the left wing. I would like to add something more. For example, when I was saying that TPLF was promoting a shifting ideology, we could see that when the TPLF governed Ethiopia was able to gain financial support from two big capitalist institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Coming to the visit of Barack Obama in 2015, Barack Obama stated that Ethiopia had democratically elected government. This has created a number of opposition to the statement of Barack Obama from the diaspora, Ethiopian diaspora, from the people of Ethiopia, from opposition leaders in Ethiopia, and particularly from Ethiopian journalists, because the reality was completely different. As I mentioned before, immediately after the elections in Ethiopia, there was a huge manifestation in Addis, and hundreds of people were killed. A number of people were put into prison. Hence, in spite of these facts, Barack Obama came to Ethiopia and stated that Ethiopia had a democratically elected government. And the strangest thing was that whenever there is an election, the TPLF or the EPRDF coalition stated that they have won the election by getting 99% of the vote, which is impossible. No political party can gain 99% of the vote of any population. Moreover, just to add some other examples, we could cite, for example, Susan Rice. She was practically a close friend of our ex-Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. After Meles Zenawi died in 2012, Susan Rice said that Meles Zenawi was a visionary leader, and he was a close friend of hers, of America. We could cite other people. There were also scholars and academicians who had a close relationship with the TPLF leaders. For example, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's a Norwegian name, Kjetil Trombolt, a Norwegian scholar. And some other person is Martin Plaut, the ex-BBC correspondent for Africa. All these people, the academic world and the political leaders, had close connection with the TPLF. We could also mention Blair. Blair was also a close friend of Meles Zenawi, the ex-prime minister of Ethiopia. Meles Zenawi was invited to international meetings when he was alive. Hence, the political position of various Western diplomats in favor of TPLF, we could say, is a cumulative effect or the cumulative result of the networking that the TPLF made during the 27 years that it ruled Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been, it's quite obvious that Ethiopia has been under pressure from the, because of Western diplomacy. There are, especially after the conflict, there are some issues that the Western diplomats, governments used to mention or used to request the Ethiopian government. For example, one of the questions that were usually mentioned or they used to request the Ethiopian government was to stop the war in Tigray immediately. This was one of the questions. And the other was the withdrawal of Ethiopian federal troops from Tigray and the withdrawal of the Eritrean troops, as well as, this is really astonishing, the withdrawal of the special regional forces of Amhara from Tigray. Also, we know that the special forces of Amhara have never gone to Tigray. The other question is the Ethiopian government was continuously condemned of human rights violations. This regarded also the Eritrean troops in Tigray. Moreover, one of the issues that was repeatedly said by the Western diplomats and journalists as well is the access of humanitarian, the immediate access of humanitarian aid to the people of Tigray. These are the most important questions raised by the Western diplomats regarding the Ethiopian government. Following this, there were some, we could say, some kind of economic sanctions taken by the European Union and the United States, and this was followed also by the visa sanctions imposed on Ethiopian leaders and also the CPLF leaders. And in this moment, I think there is a bill known as HR 6,600, if I remember well, a bill has to be approved. I don't know. There might come other sanctions on Ethiopia. These are some of the measures and the relationships that were between Ethiopia and the foreign diplomats and the Western governments.
Excusez-moi. Donc, tout au début, le TPLF avait un appui parce qu'il se faisait passer un peu comme un groupe anti-impérialiste, comme ça, mais tout de suite, ils se sont quand même transformés dans un... ils ont, disons, laissé tomber tout cet aspect-là de leur lutte. Et pendant 27 ans, ils ont eu un appui, comme on l'avait dit aussi avant, très, très fort à partir de l'Occident. Et on peut donner un exemple par exemple, un exemple du voyage d'Obama en 2015 où il y avait eu des élections et où quand même, il y a eu beaucoup de morts, beaucoup des personnes qui ont été mises en prison. Et Obama arrive et dit que tout va bien. On connaît ça aussi. Et donc, cette manière un peu de vraiment soutenir ce régime au-delà de tout. Et la coalition de ce régime, et même, on a d'autres exemples comme Susan Rice, qui, quand l'un des, disons, leaders du TPLF, Meles Zenawi, était mort, elle avait dit à ses funérailles que c'était d'abord un très proche ami à elle et que c'était vraiment un leader visionnaire. Donc, on peut voir vraiment une position très pro ce groupe sans jamais le critiquer. Et il y a aussi des experts comme le Norvégien Trombel ou aussi Martin Plaut. Et ça, c'est vraiment des experts, des académiciens qui poussent la ligne du TPLF au-delà et toujours vraiment... ce qui se passe, ils sont toujours là à l'appui. Comme aussi quelqu'un comme Blair, comme Tony Blair, qui, on le trouve tout le temps, hein, je crois qu'il a aussi aujourd'hui l'aide de Kagame. Et donc, ça c'est ma parenthèse. Et donc, on voit vraiment que ils étaient toujours pendant les 27 ans vraiment à leur faveur. Et là maintenant, par contre, après quand la guerre a commencé, ils ont posé des questions assez bizarres dans le sens qu'ils demandaient que pas seulement l'armée se retire, donc pratiquement que l'armée ne doit pas défendre la souveraineté du pays, le territoire du pays, mais qu'il devrait se retirer, qu'il ne devrait pas attaquer. Et en plus, il y a même des forces spéciales de chaque région qui protègent ces régions-là, comme par exemple dans la région d'Amara, et demander même que ces forces-là se retirent, donc pratiquement qu'ils ne se défendent pas. Si on pense à la crise post-électorale ivoirienne, quand même, on voit que c'était un peu la même chose. On demandait aux forces de Gbagbo de ne pas réagir par rapport à des attaques quand même qui n'étaient pas nécessairement légales. Et donc, l'autre chose que l'Occident, dans les journaux, etc., on continue à dire qu'il y a aussi une affabulation totale, c'est l'accès humanitaire. Ils disent tout le temps dans les journaux, j'ai même vu dans Le Monde, dans d'autres journaux, qu'on dit tout le temps qu'on n'a pas l'accès humanitaire à la région de Tigré, qu'il n'y a pas un accès. Et aussi, on a fait des sanctions quand même vis-à-vis de l'Éthiopie et aussi de l'Érythrée. Voilà. Et je pose la même question à Elias. Also, is how for you has the Western diplomacy dealt with this crisis since November 2020?
More or less the same pattern as Aster has explained in Ethiopia. Remember, the TPLF regime, while it was in power in Ethiopia for 27 years, had managed to rule Ethiopia with the blessing, the full support, the financial, economical, military, political cover, diplomatic cover of Western governments, in particular the United States. The United States, after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, had this doctrine of controlling Africa through anchor states. To control Africa, you have 4 anchor states. For the western region of Africa, the anchor state, designated anchor state, was Nigeria. For the northern, the Arab North Africa, Egypt was the designated anchor state. For the Horn of Africa, East Africa, Ethiopia was the designated anchor state. And for the southern region of Africa, of course, South Africa. So through these 4 big states, you designated them as the major client states, proxy forces to control the 4 regions. And thus you ensure your imperialist hegemony over Africa. This was the United States strategy. So for this reason, the TPLF regime was given all kinds of support, massive diplomatic cover. While it ruled Ethiopia, it committed massive atrocities, human rights violations, even genocides, such as in the Gambela region of Western Ethiopia, in the Ogaden Somali region, in Amhara, in Oromia. I mean, the crimes it committed were horrendous, but it was always covered up. The media gave it a rosy, picture. Meles Zenawi was the darling of the West. He was wined and dined. He was invited to the World Economic Forum in Davos in big conferences, and he was counted as the visionary leader. As my sister Esther mentioned, Tony Blair, for example, had this project called NEPA, New Economic Partnership for African Development. And so the 2 leaders he designated for this in Africa were Thabo Mbeki and Meles Zenawi. Meles Zenawi and the TPLF were the most corrupt kleptocratic regime in Africa, I could say. But yet the Western governments gave them all the time favorable political, diplomatic cover and media coverage. And they covered up their crimes, their massive crimes against humanity. This was during the 27 years of their reign in power. So, for example, with the pushing, the prodding of the United States, the TPLF regime invaded Somalia in 2006. This is a sovereign nation. So the invasion of a sovereign nation was blessed by the United States, and even the regional organization called IGAD, just as you have ECOWAS in West Africa, we have in East Africa, Horn of Africa, a regional organization called IGAD. IGAD even gave it its blessing. So the neighboring puppet states like Kenya, Uganda also kept silent while a sovereign nation was being invaded. The only country to oppose this was Eritrea. And for this, Eritrea was punished by having sanctions imposed on it at the United Nations Security Council. So it's this kind of political machinations, cover-ups, diplomatic cover-ups. Even the Western human rights organizations never fully reported and publicized the massive atrocities and crimes against humanity that TPLF committed in Ethiopia in its 27 years of misrule, tyrannical misrule. The most brutal, I mean, tens of thousands of political prisoners, disappearing of journalists and politicians, genocide in Gambela, genocide in Ogaden Somali region, and all kinds of brutalities were committed, but nothing whatsoever. Now you fast forward to November 2020 when TPLF ignited this war. Its former supporters in the West, in particular in Washington, those who were in the Obama administration, people like Susan Rice, like Samantha Power, like who were waiting in the wings. Remember, November 3, 2020 was also the US election. So Trump lost by that time. It was not coincidence that they launched this war on Ethiopia and Eritrea on that particular date, November 3, November 4. Because in US political system, if the president loses, that becomes a lame duck period. So until January 2021, when the new administration assumes power, the existing president is called a lame duck president. There's nothing much he can do, okay? So this allowed them to carry out this treasonous insurrectionary war with impunity. And of course, those who were waiting in the wings were given it coverage behind the scene. The massive Western media propaganda was given it favorable coverage. The TPLF was the aggressor, but the Western media was painting it as the victim. So you have this propaganda ploy of inverting the victim and the aggressor. So the TPLF was committing massacre against the Amhara civilians in a place called Maikadra. Horrendous massacre, over 1,000 people that it killed through its militias. This is recorded. Even Amnesty International had to grudgingly admit this because it was impossible to hide by the time the facts came out. And yet, this was somehow obfuscated, covered up, and they manufactured something called Aksum massacre, which never happened, and blamed Eritrea for this. So you had this kind of manufactured genocide, manufactured atrocities in Tigray, rape, and what have you. And the aggressor, the TPLF, became the victim. And through this kind of media coverage, cover up and diplomatic cover up, then the atrocities, the crimes against humanity of the TPLF was covered up, as was done in its previous 27 years in power in Ethiopia.
Thank you. Donc, si on regarde dans l'histoire, disons l'administration, on regarde dans les 27 ans qu'ils étaient au pouvoir, que ce gouvernement était au pouvoir du TPLF, on voit quand même que les États-Unis avaient toujours dans la région de l'Afrique des États auxquels elles s'accrochaient, qui étaient un peu les États phares qui allaient contrôler le reste de la région. Donc, on avait le Nigeria en Occident, on avait l'Égypte au nord, l'Éthiopie dans l'est et l'Afrique du Sud dans le sud. C'était un peu les pays, et même avec des crimes atroces qu'ils avaient commis, ils avaient commis des génocides dans la région de Gambela, de Amara aussi, comment on dit en français, je ne sais pas.
Somalie.
Ogaden, c'est la région Somalie, Ogaden. Là aussi, il y avait vraiment eu des génocides, des massacres atroces. Mais vu l'appui qu'ils ont eu, spécialement de la part des Occidents, des États-Unis, et il n'y a jamais eu une tentative d'en parler. Ça a été toujours, disons, mis sous, comment on dit, mis sous le tapis, comme on connaît très bien. Et donc, même le Meles Zenawi, comme on avait parlé avant, il a été invité à Davos ou dans les grandes institutions, au World Economic Forum, au Forum économique mondial. Et on avait toujours donné l'impression que c'était vraiment, on voulait donner cette impression-là que c'était un pays, même quand ils ont envahi la Somalie, l'Éthiopie avait envahi la Somalie en 2006. Je crois que c'était 6 ou 5. Somalia was 2006 or 5?
2006, correct, yeah.
2006, ils avaient envahi la Somalie. Ils ont eu vraiment, dans les États-Unis n'avaient rien dit, et même dans la sous-région, on a un peu, comme on a ECOWAS en Afrique de l'Ouest, on a IGAD en Afrique de l'Est, et là aussi, aucun pays avait rien dit, ni le Kenya, ni l'Ouganda. Imaginez-vous, ils sont en train d'envahir un autre pays, et le seul pays qui était contre cette guerre, c'était l'Érythrée. Mais tout de suite, les Américains, ils ont sanctionné, ils ont tout de suite reçu des sanctions, toujours dans le but vraiment de cette couverture. Donc vraiment, une brutalité incroyable où des milliers de personnes ont été torturées, des journalistes qui sont disparus, des politiciens, et tout ça a jamais été mis en avant parce que caché. Et cette même administration, elle est venue, c'est de nouveau l'administration d'Obama qui est revenue au pouvoir. Et ce que Elias Amar, elle souligne, c'est que l'attaque qui est survenue de 3 ou 4 novembre 2020, c'est pas vraiment par hasard, parce que normalement dans les élections américaines, quand l'un des deux présidents a déjà gagné, dans cette période-là, avant qu'il arrive, qu'il entre dans le pouvoir, donc, de novembre en janvier, il y a un peu un moment où le président sortant ne peut vraiment rien faire. Et c'est pour ça que tous ces personnages après de l'administration Obama, comme Susan Rice, Samantha Power, ils sont après revenus au pouvoir et c'est eux qui avaient déjà avant fait toute cette couverture que rien sort. Et vraiment des choses terribles parce qu'on parle pas du fait que même le 9 novembre 2020, il y a eu le massacre de Maïkandra, qui était un massacre où on parle de 1000 personnes qui étaient tuées. La chose terrible, c'est qu'on n'en parle pas du tout. On fait semblant que c'était pas autant grave et on a même inventé un autre massacre, le massacre d'Aksum, qui est en réalité une fabrication.